What if I told you that, just minutes ago, the palace quietly enacted one of the most brutal decisions in recent royal history? A decision so severe, so absolute, that it effectively erases a member of the royal family from every privilege, every protection, and every lifeline she once relied on. Because yes, it is now officially confirmed. Sarah Ferguson, the Duchess of York, has been completely cut off from all royal benefits, effective immediately. This isn't a minor adjustment or a standard budget review. This is a sudden severance, no financial support, no security, no access to estates, staff, or medical care tied to the crown. Overnight, a woman who survived cancer, scandal, divorce, and decades of scrutiny has been pushed out of the royal system she once served and suffered for. And the biggest question echoing through Buckingham right now is simple. Insiders report a late-night emergency meeting with the senior courtiers, followed by an unusually blunt internal memo. There was no ceremony, no warm wording, just a direct order cutting Sarah loose. Some sources claim this move is tied to her recent health scares. Others whisper it was driven by political motives. And a few believe this is only the first step in a much larger restructuring of the monarchy, one that might involve removing more unnecessary members. But here's the part that no one can ignore. Why was this decision executed in complete silence? Why now? And who exactly pushed it through? Before we go deeper into the hidden motives behind this unprecedented action, I want to hear from you. Do you think Sarah Ferguson is being targeted? Or is the palace hiding something much darker? Comment your thoughts below. Yeah, awesome, bomb. Because what comes next may change everything. Now, let's get into the full story. To understand why the palace moved with such shocking brutality, we need to go back to when the warning signs were already forming long before the public noticed anything unusual. Here's what they don't want you to know. Inside the royal household, Sarah's situation wasn't viewed as a sudden crisis. It was seen as the slow, inevitable unraveling of a woman caught in the tightening grip of royal rules, financial catastrophe, and shifting political tides. When King Charles ascended to the throne, he brought a governing philosophy his advisors had anticipated for decades: a streamlined monarchy, smaller, sharper, and far less forgiving of individuals who carried what they called reputational risk. Under Queen Elizabeth, Sarah had always been an exception. She was welcomed at family gatherings, allowed to remain at Royal Lodge with Prince Andrew, treated gently despite her missteps. Elizabeth operated with grace, with memory, with sentiment. But Charles inherited a different world, a world where online scrutiny is merciless, where political pressure is relentless, where the institution could no longer afford what one senior aide quietly called nostalgic allowances. And here's the uncomfortable truth that changed everything. Unlike Andrew, Sarah held no title of Her Royal Highness. Unlike working royals, she had no public role to justify security or housing support. And unlike the newer generation, William, Catherine, and their children, she represented a past version of the monarchy, one weighed down by controversies the crown was desperate to bury forever. Behind palace walls, discussions about Royal Lodge began much earlier than anyone realized. The rising maintenance costs, the future use of grace and favor residences, the legal structure tying Andrew to the property. Each time these issues surfaced, Sarah's name appeared as an unavoidable complication. Without an HRH title, without duties, without a defined institutional purpose, she was an anomaly in a system built entirely on hierarchies. But tradition and cost weren't the only forces driving the shift. Here's where it gets dark. Political figures in Westminster began pressing the monarchy quietly but firmly to address lingering concerns connected to the Epstein fallout. The public, especially those who remembered the scandals of the 1990s, increasingly questioned why a non-working divorced duchess continued living in a crown estate property. The palace noticed. They logged the polling numbers. They recognized the pattern. Sarah was becoming a symbol of everything Charles's modernization plans sought to eliminate. Can you see it now? The walls were already closing in. The decision was no longer if, but when. And as these pressures converged, legal, financial, reputational, political, The once small conversations about Sarah's future grew sharper, more urgent, and impossible to avoid. Catherine's discovery. But there's someone else in this story. Someone whose quiet observations revealed just how serious this situation had become. Princess Catherine. The first real signs of trouble didn't come from headlines or scandals. They came from subtle, easily overlooked anomalies that only those closest to the royal system noticed. And for Catherine, whose life had been shaped by decades of protocol and public expectation, these irregularities around Sarah Ferguson began to feel like warning bells nobody else wanted to hear. It started during a routine briefing at Kensington Palace. Catherine overheard two staff members discussing Windsor properties. One mentioned that Royal Lodge maintenance cost projections had doubled again. The other added with uncomfortable hesitation, "The complication remains. Sarah's still living there, still not a working royal, still tied to Andrew's diminishing position." Catherine didn't intervene. She simply paused, absorbing the tone, because she knew when palace staff speak tentatively, something deeper is always brewing. Weeks later, another inconsistency surfaced. Catherine received a briefing pack summarizing public sentiment toward different royal family branches. Most was predictable: strong support for the Wales family, cautious optimism around Charles's modernization. But one graph caught her attention: an unexpected spike in negative sentiment associated with the York household, not toward Beatrice or Eugenie, who remained privately respected, specifically towards Sarah. The phrasing in the analysis was telling. Public perception reflects unresolved associations and outdated expectations. Catherine understood exactly what that meant. Then came the moment that changed everything. During a spring charity event, Catherine greeted well-wishers along the rope line when an older woman leaned in and gently asked, "Dear, why is the Duchess of York still in that big house if she's not working for the crown? It doesn't look quite right, does it?" Catherine smiled politely, offering a diplomatic reply, but inside she felt a tightness forming. When ordinary citizens voice the same concerns private advisors whisper, the gap between public understanding and palace silence has become too dangerous to ignore. Meanwhile, inside Windsor, the atmosphere had shifted dramatically. Staff who once described Andrew and Sarah's arrangement as odd but functional now used different language: strained, unsettled, uncertain. Even more revealing were the briefings about foreign press coverage. American outlets were quietly linking Sarah back into the Epstein narrative because of her past emails, including the infamous one calling him a supreme friend and the revived congressional inquiry. Catherine knew how catastrophic this was. Once an individual becomes part of an international scandal discussion, the Crown's risk assessment changes completely, and Sarah had no role, no institutional shield, no functional justification to keep her within the royal framework. Late that summer, Catherine was shown an internal document summarizing external reputational threats. Sarah was listed prominently. The reasoning was stark: non-working royal with unstable finances. Public visibility and unresolved associations invite scrutiny, inconsistent with modernization strategy. Do you understand what that means in royal terms? It was the beginning of the end. The strategic meeting. By the time the decision was finalized, conversations inside Buckingham Palace had shifted from quiet concern to strategic urgency. The question was no longer whether action should be taken. It was how far the crown was prepared to go. And at the center of this transformation stood Queen Camilla, a woman who understood better than most how fragile the monarchy's public image could be. Camilla's mornings often began with thick folders of press summaries. But in recent months, a disturbing pattern had emerged. Major American outlets were no longer focusing solely on Prince Andrew's downfall. They were turning their attention to Sarah: articles in the Washington Post, segments on MSNBC, late-night discussions on CNN, all asking pointed questions about why the Duchess of York still occupied a Crown Estate residence while carrying reputational risks linked to Andrew's scandals and her own financial disasters. The tone was shifting from curiosity to open criticism. And for a monarchy hyper-aware of its international image, this development mattered profoundly. Camilla called a private meeting in the green drawing room, a space quiet enough to avoid casual eavesdropping. Those invited included Sir Edward Chapman, Fiona Lyall, and Rupert Kane, senior advisors with decades of crisis management experience. She opened with characteristic calm, but the urgency in her voice was unmistakable. Public patience is not endless, nor is institutional tolerance. Sir Edward unfolded a document summarizing the amplification of international coverage, mentions of Sarah's financial troubles, the Epstein connection, and the revived congressional inquiry were rising sharply in American media cycles. Even mainstream British journalism, once cautious about pushing too hard on Sarah, was now framing her presence at Royal Lodge as a symbol of inconsistency. Then Princess Anne joined the discussions, and she didn't mince words. "We're trying to streamline the monarchy, not drag the past forward with us." Anne had always respected Sarah personally, but she believed institutions survived only when they followed rules, not memories. William, briefed separately at Kensington Palace, echoed the sentiment in his measured way. "We cannot continue carrying burdens that do not belong to the future we are building." But the most revealing insight came from the communications wing. Analysts presented Camilla and Charles with data showing a sharp rise in negative sentiment among viewers over 50 in the United States, a demographic loyal, deeply engaged, and often nostalgic for the Diana-era monarchy. The data was devastating. A young communications staffer reviewing engagement metrics offered an insight that silenced the room. People aren't just watching this as royal drama. They're watching it as a moral question. How much responsibility does a family bear for the actions of someone linked to them? Camilla and Charles reviewed the draft statement. The language was crisp, restrained, deeply institutional. It didn't attack Sarah. It didn't reference scandals. It framed the decision as procedural, necessary, aligned with long-term restructuring. But beneath its calm tone, anyone familiar with royal subtext could see its true meaning. The crown was stepping away permanently. Before finalizing, Camilla made a suggestion rooted in her own experience. "We must ensure this does not read as punishment. It must read as policy." Several lines were rewritten to emphasize neutrality and precedent. Inside the palace's private offices, a quiet understanding settled. The decision was irreversible, and its impact would echo far beyond Windsor and Buckingham Palace. The announcement, the full palace statement, went live, a meticulously worded document that rippled across the world within minutes. It was short, polished, and unmistakably final. The Crown confirmed that effective immediately. Sarah Ferguson would no longer receive housing provisions, security consideration, or transitional support from the royal household. Every line felt like a door slamming shut. For Sarah, the impact was immediate and devastating. She was sitting at a small writing desk in the corner of a London hotel suite when her phone erupted with notifications. She had moved there quietly days earlier, sensing something decisive was coming, but not knowing how hard it would land. When she saw the official Buckingham Palace header appear on her screen, she froze. For a moment or two, she simply stared at the announcement, reading it twice as if the words might shift the second time around. They didn't. What struck her first wasn't the loss of Royal Lodge. That had been foreshadowed for months. It was the tone, the absence of warmth, the formality, the unmistakable message that the Crown was drawing a clean, unbridgeable line between Sarah Ferguson and the institution she had once married into. Regardless of the years spent rehabilitating her reputation, the charity events, the children's books, the public resilience, none of it mattered. Now, in the eyes of the monarchy, she was no longer part of its future. Across newsrooms worldwide, the reaction was shock mixed with grim recognition. The palace's modernization strategy under King Charles had always hinted at a leaner, more focused royal structure. But nobody expected the shift to land so sharply and so publicly on the Duchess of York. The timing felt surgical. Andrew was already being relocated to a smaller property. The Epstein investigation in the United States was accelerating. Pressure from Parliament to ensure ethical clarity around royal associations had reached its highest point in years. For observers, it was clear Sarah had become a liability the crown could no longer afford to defend. The global media storm intensified as pundits recounted her long list of setbacks, her financial entanglements including the failed Pegasus Bitcoin venture, the infamous email calling Epstein a supreme friend, her charity partnerships now framed as a career cut short by association and misjudgment, even her personal resilience, once admired, became part of a tragic narrative about a woman who had been offered second chances but never found solid footing. The daughter's desperate plan. But while the world dissected the public fallout, something far more personal and far more desperate was unfolding in the shadows. Beatrice and Eugenie had been preparing for this moment. According to sources close to the sisters, they were devastated but unsurprised. They had known the announcement would be definitive, and they had taken steps quietly, urgently to prepare their mother's escape route. Their property in the coastal region of Comporta, Portugal, had already been readied. Staff arranged temporary accommodations. Local contacts helped secure privacy upon arrival. Make no mistake, this wasn't a vacation plan. This was a relocation plan, a survival plan. The sisters moved with military precision, determined to ensure their mother had somewhere safe, quiet, and controllable to land. But beneath the practical task lay a deeper, more heartbreaking fear that once Sarah left the UK, the distance between her and the monarchy would become permanent, irreversible. Meanwhile, inside the palace, advisors felt a strange mixture of relief and apprehension. Relief because a lingering institutional dilemma had finally been resolved. Apprehension because Sarah remained unpredictable, historically outspoken, a woman who had never disappeared quietly. Her financial instability made her vulnerable to book deals. Her long relationship with Andrew meant she had knowledge that could unsettle the monarchy further if ever revealed. And her reputation as a woman who refused to fade away made her next steps impossible to predict. The hidden motives. Now we arrive at the question everyone's asking, but nobody's answering. What are the real motives behind this decision? Because if you think this is simply about modernization or financial efficiency, you haven't been paying attention. Let me break down what's really happening behind those palace walls. Motive 1, the Epstein shadow. The revived congressional inquiry in the United States isn't just examining Andrew. Investigators have begun asking questions about financial connections, communications, and associations that extend to Sarah, her past emails, her business dealings, her proximity to figures under scrutiny. All of it creates exposure the Crown cannot tolerate. By severing ties with Sarah now, the palace creates legal distance. If she's investigated, questioned, or implicated in any way, the monarchy can truthfully claim she has no official connection to the institution. That's not coincidence, that's strategy. Motive 2, financial liability. Sarah's financial history is a minefield. The failed business ventures, the mounting debts, the questionable partnerships. Each one represents potential embarrassment for the Crown. But here's what's truly alarming. Sources suggest Sarah may have been seeking financial assistance from the royal household to cover legal fees and security costs. The palace had to make a choice: continue propping up someone with no official role or cut ties completely. They chose severance over support. Motive 3, the American audience. The palace is acutely aware of American sentiment and American viewers, especially those over 50 who represent a massive engaged audience, have been increasingly vocal about the York situation. Polling data showed this demographic questioning the monarchy's judgment in maintaining ties with Sarah given the controversies. For an institution that depends on international goodwill and soft power, losing American support is unthinkable. This announcement was as much for Washington and New York as it was for London. Motive 4, William's succession planning. William is thinking decades ahead. He's building a monarchy for George, Charlotte, and Louis. And in that vision, there's no room for the complicated, scandal-tainted figures of the past. Sources close to William suggest he's been the strongest voice pushing for clean breaks, not out of cruelty, but out of calculated necessity. Every lingering controversy from the previous generation becomes a weapon that can be used against the future. Motive 5, the Portugal connection. Why Portugal? Why Comporta specifically? Because it's quiet, isolated, and far from British tabloid scrutiny, because it allows the palace to say Sarah has relocated abroad for personal reasons without revealing she's essentially been exiled. Portugal isn't just a fresh start, it's a strategic containment inside the palace. The hours following the announcement carried a tension that settled into every corner of the royal ecosystem. Within minutes, the legal office convened. Advisors reviewed Crown estate lease structures and policies governing non-working royals. One lawyer summarized it with devastating clarity. Her Royal Highness status is gone. Her support structures are gone. Under current statute, there is no pathway back. At Windsor, the reality had already begun reshaping Prince Andrew's world. The logistics team confirmed he would be relocated to a smaller property before Christmas, a downsizing framed as routine restructuring, though everyone understood the symbolism. Andrew would remain under the Crown's roof. Sarah would not, at Kensington Palace. William studied the developments with thoughtful silence. He carried no personal grudge against Sarah, but understood the political risk tied to her financial instability and proximity to Andrew's scandals. Privately, staff noted William seemed relieved more than distressed. A lingering uncertainty had been resolved. Catherine's perspective, though quieter, was equally grounded. She sympathized with Sarah. Both women had endured the tabloid machine's brutality. But Catherine also knew the palace could not shield a figure whose presence complicated modernization efforts. In her view, letting Sarah step away, however harsh the optics, was the only sustainable option. The practical nightmare. Without royal support, Sarah would no longer qualify for security coverage, an immediate concern given renewed public interest in her past. The Home Office confirmed she would need to arrange her own security abroad. The financial assessment was equally grim. Without housing provisions, without security support, without the safety net she'd relied on for decades, Sarah would need to generate significant income immediately. And here's where it gets truly concerning. A financially desperate Sarah Ferguson with intimate knowledge of royal operations, personal relationships, and private conversations represents exactly the kind of risk that keeps palace advisors awake at night. Book deals, tell-all interviews, documentary participation, each represents a potential minefield. The palace had severed ties, but they hadn't eliminated risk. They'd arguably increased it. The daughters' heartbreak. Beatrice and Eugenie found themselves caught in an impossible position. Daughters torn between institutional necessity and maternal protection. They understood the palace's decision. They'd seen the mounting pressures, but understanding didn't ease the emotional devastation of watching their mother be formally expelled from the only world she'd known for nearly 4 decades. According to sources, both sisters reached out to their mother within minutes of the announcement. The conversations were brief, emotional, and focused on immediate practicalities. Because in crisis, the York women do what they've always done. They act, they protect, they survive. The preparations accelerated, documents were delivered discreetly, bank accounts were reviewed. Legal counsel was engaged for the Portugal transition. Every detail mattered because one misstep could expose their mother to dangers the palace was no longer obligated to shield her from. But beneath all the logistics lay a question neither sister wanted to voice. Once their mother left British soil, essentially exiled by the institution their grandmother once led, would she ever truly come back? Global reaction. From which country or city are you watching this moment unfold? Because this story is being interpreted completely differently depending on where you're sitting. In America, viewers see this as the monarchy finally holding itself accountable to modern ethical standards, even if painfully late. In Britain, the response is more divided. Older generations remember Sarah fondly and see this as unnecessarily harsh. Younger audiences view it as long overdue institutional housecleaning. In Europe, particularly in countries with their own monarchies, royal watchers are analyzing this as a template for how modern crowns handle legacy complications. In Commonwealth nations, The reaction ranges from sympathy to frustration that the monarchy continues generating drama when it should be focused on meaningful service. Your perspective matters because how this story resonates globally will influence how historians ultimately judge this decision. Leave a comment below telling me where you are watching from and what's your honest reaction. Sarah's silent response. Sarah remained in that London hotel suite. She hadn't issued a statement, hadn't appeared publicly, hadn't even posted on social media. A silence that, for a woman known for her communication, spoke volumes. Those closest to her described someone in a state of processing shock mixed with steely determination. She had survived scandals before, weathered divorces, financial ruin, and public humiliation. But this was different. This wasn't a scandal she could rehabilitate from or a misstep she could apologize for. This was an institutional rejection, absolute and irreversible. Friends report she spent hours on the phone with her daughters, with legal advisors, with a handful of people who remained truly loyal. She reviewed documents, made lists, planned next steps with the methodical focus of someone who understood the severity of her situation. Because Sarah Ferguson may be many things, but she's never been passive. And as night deepened over London, one truth became increasingly clear. The palace had made its move. Now the world was waiting to see how Sarah would respond. The monarchy's gamble. For King Charles and his advisors, the decision to sever ties with Sarah represents both a victory and a massive gamble. The victory: they've eliminated a complication that was becoming increasingly untenable, sent a clear message about modernization priorities, created legal and political distance from potential future scandals. The gamble: they've also created a loose cannon, a financially vulnerable, potentially angry ex-royal with decades of insider knowledge and nothing left to lose. History shows us that exiled royals don't always go quietly into the Portuguese sunset. The Duke and Duchess of Windsor, Princess Margaret in her later years, even Diana in the final year of her life, separated from the institution but still possessing the power to shake it. Sarah has that same power now, multiplied by modern media, social platforms, and an international audience hungry for royal revelations. The palace's strategy assumes Sarah will accept her exile gracefully, fade from view, and allow the monarchy to move forward without her. But what if she doesn't? What if financial desperation, personal anger, or simple human frustration leads her to start talking to journalists, documentarians, or authors who would pay significantly for her story? What if the palace just created their own worst nightmare? What this means for us. Beyond the royal headlines, this story offers profound lessons about power, loyalty, and reinvention. Lesson 1: unresolved problems don't disappear. They compound. Lesson 2: no structure built in one season lasts forever. Lesson 3: institutions prioritize survival over individuals. Always. Lesson 4: sometimes reinvention requires a forced break. The hidden truth of us. This announcement isn't the end of Sarah Ferguson's story. It's the beginning of a completely new chapter. For nearly 40 years, Sarah has existed in the shadow of the monarchy, defined by her marriage to Andrew, judged by royal standards, constrained by institutional expectations. Now, for the first time since 1986, she's completely free of those constraints. Free to speak, free to write, free to build a life entirely on her own terms without worrying about palace approval or royal protocol. Is that liberation or devastation? The answer probably depends on what Sarah chooses to do next. If she retreats quietly and lives out her years in Portuguese obscurity, then the palace wins completely. But if Sarah emerges as a voice, writing books, giving interviews, participating in documentaries that reveal uncomfortable truths about royal life, then this decision might be remembered very differently, as the moment the monarchy created its most dangerous adversary by giving someone who knew too much absolutely nothing left to lose. Final thoughts. Sarah Ferguson's fall from royal grace isn't just a headline. It's a human story about resilience, consequence, and the brutal mathematics of power. Yet, Beneath the tragedy lies something potentially transformative. Portugal may not have been her dream, but it offers distance, safety, and a chance to rebuild without the constant shadow of royal expectations. For a woman who has lived most of her adult life beneath the harsh glare of public opinion, that might be its own kind of liberation. For the monarchy, this decision marks a deliberate step toward the future King Charles has envisioned, a crown that is smaller, more accountable, more aligned with modern expectations. Power structures may define the rules, but individuals define their stories. Sarah Ferguson has been many things: controversial, resilient, unpredictable, flawed, human. But she has never ever been silent. And now that the palace has spoken firmly, finally, fatally, the world waits to see how she will respond, what she will reveal, who she will become without the walls of Windsor to define her. In the end, the decision to cut off all royal benefits for Sarah Ferguson was not just a cold announcement from the palace, but a declaration that anyone once considered part of the royal family can be removed from the circle of power at any moment. Although the reasons made public sound reasonable, it is clear that behind them lie motives the palace does not want to mention. Meetings that never appeared on the official schedule, unusual changes inside the royal office, and especially the calculated silence of several high-ranking figures. All of it creates the sense that this story still has many layers that have yet to be uncovered. Sarah was once part of the royal family, once devoted her name and her image for many years. The fact that she was removed so decisively shows that there are things the palace wants to bury very deeply. Thank you for staying with us until the end of the video. What do you think is the real reason behind this decision? Leave your opinion in the comments, and do not forget to subscribe to the channel so you can continue exploring the hidden corners of the British royal family with us.